There's a very thin line between being a superhero and being a villain. One wrong move and a hero can turn into a villain. That's what makes some characters so interesting. Not just that they're good, but that they could have so easily been bad. This closeness to becoming a villain is what we call villain origin proximity. How close someone is to having a story, motives, and personality that would make them just like their greatest enemy. And no Marvel character embodies this quite like Dr. Stephen Strange. Before we talk about Stephen Strange, we need to understand the concept. Villain origin proximity isn't just about how many bad things have happened to a person. It's about the structural similarity between their lives and a typical villain's origin story. A villain's origin often has these core ingredients that includes trauma or loss, power acquisition, and isolation or ego. Any hero with high villain origin proximity checks most of these boxes. Now, when we meet Stephen Strange in Doctor Strange 1, he was already a prime candidate for a villain arc. He had an ego bordering on narcissism. Strange is brilliant, arrogant, and condescending, but not just that. He also experienced a life-shattering trauma where his car accident not only destroyed his hands, but dismantled his identity. For Strange, the hands weren't just tools, they were the instruments of his self-worth. Without them, he's a god stripped of divinity. Also, this man was power-hungry. His initial journey into the mystic arts is selfish. He doesn't want to save the world, he wants to fix himself. That's already a classic villain start. Strange's pre-Kumar Taj life mirrors the blueprint of villains like Doctor Doom or even the MCU's Caecilius. Brilliance, loss, obsessive search for forbidden knowledge. Doctor Strange's villain origin proximity spikes during two key moments. Firstly, the Ancient One's death revelation. Strange discovers she is drawn on the Dark Dimension's power to extend her life. In that moment, his moral foundation could easily have crumbled. Hypocrisy from a mentor is a top villain trigger, especially in the case of Anakin Skywalker. Secondly, instead of killing Dormammu outright, Strange traps himself in an endless time loop of death to force a surrender. This is self-sacrifice, but also reveals comfort with playing God over cosmic entities. The choice to serve life rather than control it is proximity territory. If Strange's trajectory so closely mirrors that of MCU villains, why didn't he break bad? Well, there are three factors that kept him grounded. Firstly, the pivotal moment is Strange's confrontation with the Ancient One's philosophy. It's not about you. This blunt truth destroys his ego. Heroes who avoid villainy often have a moment where self-centered ambition gives way to a broader perspective. Without that moment, Strange could have justified bending reality as a necessary evil. Secondly, Strange was lucky to encounter mentors. First the Ancient One, then Wong, who didn't coddle his arrogance but confronted it. Many villains have no such guardrails. Strange's mentors modeled both discipline and moral boundaries, even if they themselves were imperfect. Thirdly, Strange's bond with Christine Palmer is understated but crucial. Even after entering the realm of cosmic sorcery, he still cares about one ordinary human life. Villains tend to shed these connections, seeing them as weaknesses. In Multiverse of Madness, we see just how thin that hero-villain line is when Strange encounters his variants. One was willing to sacrifice America Chavez without her consent to prevent multiversal collapse. Another one was corrupted by the Darkhold, ruling over a broken reality. Another one consumed an entire universe to reverse a personal loss. Each of these is Stephen Strange, where without one stabilizing element, restraint, luck, or love. They were not alien imposters, they were logical outcomes of his personality in different circumstances. This is villain origin proximity in motion, a single change in input variables, and Strange is no longer a hero. Take Wanda Maximoff, for example. Her Multiverse of Madness arc proves how grief plus reality-bending power equals catastrophic villainy. She just crossed the line that Strange didn't. These characters share the same scaffolding as villains, they simply resist at the decision point. However, there is an argument that heroes with high villain origin proximity pay more than those far from that line. They are constantly fighting not just external threats, but themselves. Strange has to monitor his own judgment, check his motives, and accept limits that frustrate his intellect. That's exhausting and narratively rich. His struggle isn't about being good, it's about staying good. In the MCU, that's the real superpower. And even though Doctor Strange isn't a flawless paragon, he's a recovered egotist with a god-tiered toolbox and the constant temptation to use it the wrong way. His villain origin proximity is one of the highest in Marvel's roster, and the multiverse keeps showing us what happens if he takes the wrong turn. That's what makes him compelling. He's not safe, and that's what keeps us watching. Because the moment he decides the world would be better under his control, the Sorcerer Supreme becomes the Sorcerer Tyrant. Meanwhile, Strange is not the only superhero in this case. If he was the mystic mind who nearly turned, then Tony Stark is the technological titan who almost did. And in some ways, Stark's villain origin proximity was even higher because before he became Iron Man, he was already living in a moral gray zone that most heroes never touch. The framework we used with Strange still applies here, but Tony offers an extra twist. He starts the story with several of those boxes already ticked. He had privileged power base, a self-interest, catalyst betrayal and trauma, as well as moral flexibility. Where Strange developed proximity through his transformation, Stark begins his MCU arc already halfway down the checklist. Strange's arrogance came from intellectual pride, Stark's came from wealth, privilege, and celebrity. Before Afghanistan, Stark is essentially the poster child for unchecked influence, brilliant enough to design the world's most advanced weapons, careless enough not to ask where they end up. That's something arguably more dangerous due to his indifference to consequences. Many great villains start this way, convinced that their personal comfort and genius exempt them from moral accounting. Just like Strange had his moment in Kamar Taj where he could have chosen power over principle, Stark's fork in the road happens in that Ten Rings cave. He experienced betrayal by Obadiah Stane, a mentor conspiring against him. Moreover, he also experienced a near-death trauma. Stark's injury and imprisonment could have calcified into rage rather than reflection. Many villains like Killmonger and Magneto are born in moments like this, but Stark's resistance to villainy comes from a different set of forces. He did that through his personal ownership of guilt. Rather than projecting blame outward, Stark internalizes it by taking responsibility for his actions. Then he used innovation as healing. Strange's magic could have been used to dominate, he chose to defend. But Stark does the same with technology. He builds the suit to stop threats, not to install himself as a one-man superpower. Where Strange had Christine Palmer, Stark had Pepper Potts. In both cases, a single grounded moral voice keeps the hero's ego from hardening into isolation. Meanwhile, the what-if exercise is telling that Stark returns from Afghanistan furious, not humbled. Then the Iron Man suit becomes a weapon for private military dominance. Surveillance and predictive targeting lead to preemptive assassinations. Then, global security becomes a euphemism for Stark's unilateral control. That's not a wild stretch. It's simply the Obadiah path, with Stark's charisma and marketing skills layered on top. Stark's connection to Pepper, Rhodey, Happy, and later Peter Parker keeps him human scale. Villains often fail because they lose all particular attachments. In Endgame, Strange and Stark stand at similar crossroads. Each can protect their personal peace or risk it for the greater good. Strange risks cosmic annihilation to set the board. Stark risks and gives his life to end the game. In both cases, the choice to sacrifice rather than dominate is the final decisive break from the villain path that their lives once foreshadowed. The reason both Strange and Stark work as protagonists isn't because they're paragons of virtue, it's because they are recovering an almost villain arc. Watching them win is satisfying precisely because every victory could have been a slide into control, tyranny, or vengeance. In Tony Stark, we saw a man who began his journey already halfway to a villain's throne and had to fight his way backward toward heroism. But Peter Parker, particularly the Peter of Spider-Man No Way Home, comes from the opposite angle. He starts with the instinct to do good, but finds himself pushed, inch by inch, toward a darkness he has never faced before. And yet, by the film's end, he doesn't become what grief, rage, and betrayal could have made him. He walks away from the darkness. That's villain origin proximity at its most volatile, when a character has always been good, but the story strips away their safety nets until villainy feels not only possible, but justifiable. If Strange's proximity came from his ego and Stark's from his power, Peter's is born from loss. The villain's path for Peter isn't about arrogance or control. It's about vengeance, the intoxicating belief that hurting those who hurt you will set things right. In No Way Home, Peter's villain proximity spikes so high because he loses his moral compass after the death of Aunt May. He was betrayed by the system in the multiverse chaos. He was also given the means to exact revenge with superhuman strength, but no oversight. He was isolated from everyone who could calm him down. These are the ingredients for a perfect supervillain recipe, especially for someone young, raw, and already under immense pressure. The first act of No Way Home shows Peter still operating with his classic Spider-Man morality that involves helping people, even if it's inconvenient. When the multiversal villains appear, he wants to send them back, but after discovering they will die, his instinct is to save them. That's peak Peter Parker idealism, compassion over anything else. And that's what makes The Fall so jarring. The Peter who fights Doctor Strange to keep the villains alive is the same Peter who, half a movie later, nearly beats Norman Osborn to death. That's not a slow burn, it's a cliff-edge drop in proximity. Aunt May's death is cinematic gasoline poured onto his villain's proximity. She dies because he tried to save people who deserved punishment. It reframes compassion as weakness. This is the moment when many fictional heroes choose a darker path, when they decide that sparing others is a mistake they won't repeat. It's telling that Peter's first reaction is not to protect anyone else or regroup, it's to hunt down Osborn. The restraint that defined him collapses under the weight of rage. Had Peter gone fully down that path, his transformation would have been believable and terrifying since Osborn dies at his hands. The other villains, seeing no chance for redemption, fight to the death. Then Peter becomes the Spider-Man who no longer pulls punches, but becomes ruthless, feared, and possibly lethal. And here's the strangest part. In the multiverse, versions of Peter do exist who have crossed that line. Toby's Peter admits he stopped pulling his punches after Uncle Ben died. Andrew's Peter confesses he became rageful, hinting at a darker period we never saw. The precedent is built into the Spider-Man mythos, where grief makes him dangerous. Peter's salvation in No Way Home comes down to three forces. Firstly, his peer intervention from versions of himself. This is unique to Peter's arc. The people who talk him down are him. Toby and Andrew aren't just mentors, they're living proof of what happens when grief catches up with him. Toby has walked to the edge and come back. Andrew has lived in that darker place and regrets it. Peter gets a compressed high-stakes therapy session with the only people who could truly understand his pain. Secondly, May's dying wish. With great power, there must also come great responsibility, as a moral inheritance. Peter's decision not to kill Osborn in the climax isn't forgiveness, it's obedience to that legacy, even when every nerve in his body wants the opposite. Thirdly, he chose consequence over comfort. The final spell that he needs to erase himself from the lives of everyone he loves is the anti-villain choice. Villains preserve their comfort at all costs. Peter sacrifices his entire personal life to protect others from danger. This is where the continuation from Tony Stark's story is seen. Both men faced defining moments when the tools at their disposal could have turned them into something monstrous. Both could have rationalized it as justice. Stark's anchor was love and accountability. Peter's was legacy and pure intervention. Stark chose the greater good over personal safety in Endgame. Peter chooses the greater good over personal existence in No Way Home. And both arcs underline the same truth about villain origin proximity. Proximity doesn't vanish when you make the right choice. Stark could have slipped in Age of Ultron. Peter could slip again if future grief hits without those same guardrails. Stark's and Strange's villain proximities were intellectual exercises. We could imagine them turning, but they began as adults with developed moral identities. Peter is a teenager. His proximity is scarier because his moral framework is still forming, his emotions are raw, untempered by age or repeated failure, and the leap from hero to villain would be a first, not a fall from a previous redemption. That's why No Way Home works as more than a crossover gimmick. It's the MCU's closest brush yet with a hero actually taking a villain's life out of rage. The iron of villain origin proximity is that resisting it often costs more than giving in. Stark died to avoid becoming a tyrant. Strange sacrifices comfort and certainty. Peter loses everything personal to ensure no one else gets hurt. In the long term, the villain choice is always easier. Kill Osborn, keep your girlfriend, live your life. The hero choice is lonelier, heavier, and in Peter's case, leaves him in a dingy apartment sewing his own suit. But that's why it matters, because villain origin proximity is only interesting when the escape is painful. Peter Parker's story in No Way Home is the cleanest demonstration yet that a hero's greatest threat isn't the villain in front of them, it's the villain they could become. Stark's journey showed us how privilege can tilt you toward control. Strange's journey showed how power can tempt you into playing God. And Peter's journey showed how grief can pull you into vengeance. In fiction and in life, the difference between hero and villain isn't the power they hold, it's whether they believe the world is theirs to save, or theirs to own.